Good afternoon and welcome to today's joint UNICEF and LCPS webinar on the alarming state of childhood poverty in Lebanon. Before we start with today's critical discussion on the impact of the country's multiple crises on the rights of children and households, allow me to point out that there is simultaneous translation from English to Arabic. You can access it by clicking on the globe with the title Interpretation at the bottom of your screen. Despite the challenging context in Lebanon, that only underscores the need of today's discussion, this event is made possible thanks to the collective dedication from both UNICEF and LCPS. So please join me in thanking all the communication, logistical, and research teams of UNICEF and LCPS, our panelists and discussants, who I will introduce shortly, and our translators for allowing us to put a much-needed spotlight on the alarming incursion on the rights of children in Lebanon. As Lebanon's crisis endures and worsens, core dimensions of human rights like access to education, healthcare, essential utilities like electricity and water, and income are becoming increasingly scarce in Lebanon. The state of deprivation in the country is growing in scale and intensity. Poverty is truly all around us, and it is exacerbating existing structural inequalities, disproportionately affecting those with life cycle vulnerabilities, such as people living with disabilities or families struggling to raise children. But while we all track the crisis on our phones and live through the country's daily unraveling, up-to-date national data and information has been lacking. In a new qualitative study titled Deprived Childhoods, UNICEF sheds a light on this shifting tide of vulnerability and alienation in the country by portraying the human side to the deteriorating and multidimensional state of childhood poverty. We're especially grateful to have the authors of that report with us today to help unpack its main findings and put it in context with UNICEF's ongoing research and work on childhood poverty. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Yasmin Ibrahim and Mr. Jamil Al-Khouri. Yasmin Ibrahim is a social policy specialist at the UNICEF Lebanon Country Office. She works in the social policy unit, specifically leading on public finance for children, with a core supportive role on policy analysis and the child poverty agenda. Yasmin was a main interlocutor with the government of Lebanon on the development of the National Social Protection Strategy, which advocates for a comprehensive, sustainable, and inclusive system in the country. Since 2017, Mr. Jamil Al-Khouri has been working for UNICEF Lebanon as a research and evaluation officer, leading on the management, quality assurance, and ethical review processes of research studies and impact evaluation to drive better results for children, while ensuring gender consideration and inclusion of people with disabilities. Jamil also works on the governance of research, ensuring compliance to organizational values and operational procedures. Allow me in this moment to guide you all with the agenda of today's discussion. We will start off with an introductory note from UNICEF's Ms. Sarah Haig, Chief of Social Policy for UNICEF Lebanon Country Office. Today's event would not be possible without her leadership and genuine dedication to uplifting the rights of children. Thank you all for joining us today. Moving forward, Yasmin Ibrahim and Jamil Al-Khouri will offer a timely presentation on their recent work on childhood poverty in the country. Thank you both for walking us through your research and the alarming implications it presents. After hearing from the UNICEF team, we will open the floor to two discussants to help broaden the discussion and incorporate the nuanced perspectives of our two discussants, Ms. Amelia Charles and Mr. Adib Nam. Ms. Amelia Charles is the Social Protection, Food Security, and Livelihoods Technical Advisor at Save the Children International in Lebanon. Currently, she is also Acting Director of Program Development and Quality. Ms. Charles's technical expertise covers the breadth of child poverty, and she has Save the Children's focal point for household economy analysis in Lebanon, an approach that analyzes how shocks, including changes in market dynamics, impact families and their children. Mr. Adib Nam is a consultant and expert on development and socioeconomic policies and poverty. He is currently the Senior Policy Advisor for the Arab NGO Network for Development, ANND, and an independent consultant on development issues. He previously worked as a regional advisor on Agenda 2030 and SDGs at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, ESCWA. Prior to that, he worked as a consultant with the UNDP Beirut office between 1995 and 2005 as a project manager for poverty reduction policies with the Ministry of Social Affairs, before joining the regional UNDP office as policy advisor for poverty reduction in 2005. Thank you both for joining us. We are all looking forward to listening to your expert reflections. Finally, after hearing from both our panelists and discussants, we will open the floor to a moderated discussion that will help further spotlight the implications of the report and the general state of childhood poverty in the country. For audience members who would like to ask questions, I encourage you to please submit your questions in writing. If time permits, I will then present your questions to our speakers. Lebanon is not in a temporary recession. We are stuck deep in a deliberate depression, which comes at enormous cost. The rising vulnerability of children in Lebanon and the multidimensional attacks on their childhoods, their dreams, and on the intimate bonds with their families will be irreversible. The very foundations of society that make us who we are, that bind us to one another, are falling apart. There are no shortstop measures to managing Lebanon's black hole of a depression. Only the ever-urgent need for decisive action to stabilize the crisis and set the country towards a sustainable and just recovery. If not for us, at least for our children's sake. I am very grateful to you all for joining us today to help draw attention to such a critical plight. With that, please join me in thanking our panelists and discussants, the staff at UNICEF and LCPS, and help me please welcome Ms. Sarah Haig. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think you give me and everybody one of the nicest introductions. So kind to hear all of those warm words from everybody. It's lovely to see you, Adib. Hello, I hope you're doing well. It's been a while. And hi, Emilia and others connected. I see Makram is there and so many other people. I wanted to just answer one question before we get started, is just to say, why are we having this event? And we are all, I think, very painfully aware of the situation in Lebanon. So we sometimes feel that we don't need to keep discussing it. We all are very aware of the collapse of services, of the economic situation, and the impact that it's having on families, including our own families of the Lebanese, as well as households across the country. But I think there is a tendency very often to resort to the anecdotes and the stories, the comments, things you read on social media, because there is not always a complete picture available to us about the reality of the situation as it is now and how it is worsening. And in any country, you have a responsibility to know how people are faring as a whole. You have a responsibility to know how vulnerable groups are faring, how children are doing. And in Lebanon, we don't have that national counterpart to be able to tell us, okay, on a regular up-to-date basis, this is how people are doing. This is how vulnerable people are doing. This is how children are doing. And the deeper you get into a crisis, the more that responsibility seems to increase. We need to know concretely how the situation is impacting people across the country, across all people, but particularly vulnerable groups, particularly households who are trying to raise children, as well as many other groups. You know that we have been working with the government for some time to develop a national disability allowance. We need to support other groups that face particular life cycle vulnerabilities. So we have this responsibility to know we cannot always rely on these anecdotes or what we discuss in our out of hours time or what we're reading on social media. We need to have regular data, which is coming regularly, updating us on the situation in the country. And UNICEF has been working for the past almost 18 months, more than 18 months, to produce a snapshot, a nationally representative snapshot across different nationalities of key indicators once every 6 months. And I see that the head of that team, Zarak, is connected as well. And this is what Jamil will present, the results of some of these surveys over the last 18 months to tell us every 6 months how people's situation is changing and is worsening. In addition to that, we don't have this qualitative side, and this is often something which is left out of the profile of poverty nationally and globally. It's these stories, it's the human side which really sheds a light on the reality of how people are living today, that goes well beyond the statistics, because we're great at statistics in Lebanon. We have so many statistics from, this year, from 10 years ago, from the census in the 1930s. But we also need to interpret those and provide them with the context. So this is why we also did this qualitative analysis. So we wanted to share, quite simply, we wanted to share this. We wanted to continue some of these conversations with so many different stakeholders on the context in Lebanon, and to see how we want to move forward this conversation. I think Nicholas was referring to an article that was published today that LCPS put out on the results of some of these studies, and so many other pieces of research and analysis are underway, which can contribute not only to understanding the context, but of course saying, well, what then? What do we want to do going forward? Because we can advocate to the government, but there may also, of course, be other channels for us to be able to raise our voice and call for a change. So I'm going to stop there. And Nicholas, I hand back over to you. Thank you for organizing the event. Thank you for bringing us together. And thank you to everybody connected for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I encourage you all to please pay attention to the presentation of the report from UNICEF's side. The floor is yours, Jimmy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, I will start with the presentation. So as Nicola mentioned, my name is Yasmin, and I'm part of the social policy team in UNICEF Lebanon country office. So we will just walk you through the objectives, the rationale behind the study, and the main findings and results of both the qualitative and quantitative study. And just before we start, I want to start with defining what is multidimensional poverty, or at least the definition that the study relied on, which identifies basically with material deprivations and basically stating that children living in poverty are deprived in multiple domains, such as nutrition, education, health, and so on. And they have a lack of access to goods and services, which basically affect their growth and development. In terms of rationale of the study, it really aims to update the literature that is currently available in Lebanon on the status of child poverty, especially in light of the current crisis and the challenges that households are facing every day. And also to fill in the gap, as the typical poverty measures rely on money metric measures and income measures. And this study, which is qualitative, comes to complement these qualitative studies, as it offers a deeper understanding of child poverty. The objectives of the study, as I mentioned, it's very timely when it comes to, especially in light of the crisis that is ongoing. It was also done to introduce the child component into the dialogue and debate around child poverty and vulnerabilities in Lebanon today. Also to introduce, to illustrate the characteristics and understand what are the determinants and characteristics of child poverty in Lebanon. And obviously to inform, as I mentioned earlier, the monitoring indicators such as the multidimensional poverty index, and feed into future quantitative studies. In terms of methodology, the study relied on a very innovative approach, as it asked participants to provide videos and drawings or pictures on how they are defining poverty, how they are experiencing poverty on a day-to-day basis, what are the challenges that they're facing, and also to illustrate the issues that are important to them on their aspirations, their hopes, the way they see the future. and to share about how they're experiencing poverty. And this was very important as it helps power the balance between the participants and the researcher. In terms of instruments, the study relied on key informant interviews from the relevant ministries, municipalities, UN organizations, as well as local and international NGOs. It also had a number of focus group discussions among the three nationalities of Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian refugees, and across all 8 governorates of Lebanon. And it also had 4 additional case studies to focus on particular issues such as children with disabilities, single parenting, a caregiver with a disability, and child marriage. Sorry. Just to highlight before starting with the findings that the study relied on 2 main conceptual frameworks, which placed the child at the center, and then it analyzed the world of the child, the world around the child, and the world at large in terms of laws, politics, and legal framework that affect children. And obviously, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was the backbone of the study, as it relied on the rights that are not there for children to fulfill their full potential. So basically, it placed the child at the center, and all the questions and findings of the study were analyzed around the different dimensions that affect children. And how is multidimensional poverty, how is poverty affecting these different domains or dimensions that are surrounding the child? And it went deeper into each dimension and domain to understand more the poverty, how is it affecting children from multiple dimensions and multiple domains. Just before moving to the findings, some limitations that are worth highlighting, given that this is a qualitative analysis and the sample size that was done, the findings cannot be generalized, but it gives us an in-depth understanding of how is poverty and multidimensional poverty affecting children. Just like any other study, this study has a human bias, including selection and information, but this was mitigated by selecting facilitator who had extensive experience in collecting qualitative data and attending various trainings. And obviously, there were the contextual limitations that were there in the country, such as limited internet or connectivity, the COVID-19 restrictions that were done during the crisis, the fuel crisis that limited transportation, and so on. At the level of the findings, so the study shows that the multidimensional poverty is affecting children very profoundly and deeply. And first, there is the right to childhood is deprived. As children, they showed that they have a very high level of awareness and understanding of the situation, of their status, and also as the rights as children, what they are owed to, and that they feel that their rights are being violated in this country, especially when compared to elsewhere in the world. And we've seen that in the study, children are more aware on and adjusting their behavior towards their parents, limiting their requests and their asks. And this has increased a sense of responsibility and unnecessary mental load on the child. Also children, in terms of family dynamics, we've seen very clearly that the relationship between the parent and the child has been eroded, especially when the child is becoming the income earner, and in some cases he's becoming the sole income earner. And this has affected the trust in the parents, and from their turn, the parents were feeling remorse and guilt for not being able to provide for the child. And there was this one very striking quote from a father who says that my son does not call me Baba anymore because he does not see this role in him anymore. In terms of children's outlook to rights, to education and career opportunities, it was very negatively seen, especially in the context of Lebanon. And when asked about their aspirations and their future, it was also very negatively affected. So children, they are aware that their path towards their dreams and hopes is education. And even when children were still in school, they felt that Lebanon presented very limited opportunities. And this was felt by a strong desire to leave the country and immigrate. Moving on to health. So obviously, in terms of rights to access to health, it has deteriorated significantly over the past 2 years. And many caregivers spoke about not being able to provide the necessary medical health care to their children, or delaying the treatment, either due to the unavailability or shortage of the required medicines, or the cost, and therefore not being able to afford the medicine. And this was very particular for children with disabilities who were very negatively affected during this situation. We've seen that the multiple deprivations have a profound impact on the mental health of children. There is a sense of hopelessness, pessimism, despair, and stress. And as one child expresses the way he feels today in this situation, he says, "I neither feel like a boy nor a man. I feel like a worthless kid." And just to conclude with the findings, simply, which was very, very striking, is the right to play. So children felt that the right to play is very severely affected and is limited, and especially children living in poverty. They're usually in neighborhoods that are maybe unsafe, so increasing these limitations. And this limitations was more strongly seen among girls who face additional challenges and limitations because due to harassment, so they'd rather stay home, and so on. So there was this feel of boredom, lack of enthusiasm, and children were exposed to dangers, therefore raising protection concerns. Just to end and with a focus on gender, some of the findings, as I mentioned earlier, there are limitations on the movement of girls and to go outside home due to street harassment. Girls were deprived from education and aspiration, and therefore there was an increase in child marriage, and also among single mothers where there's stigma and harassment towards them. And with that, I will pass it on to Jamil, who will provide the findings of the quantitative analysis.
You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. This is Jamil. I'm the Research Evaluation Officer for UNICEF, and I will be presenting the CFRA in short, or the Child Focused Rapid Assessment that we've been doing on 6 months basis. So what is the CFRA? As I mentioned, it stands for the Child Focused Rapid Assessment, and it's basically a very short rapid survey that collects evidence on selected indicators related to the situation of children in Lebanon, given the volatile context that we're living in. It started back in 2021, when we noticed, like, since 2019, Lebanon didn't really generate any evidence when it came to the lives of children. And after 2019, a lot of crises and the context has changed drastically, and the situation as we know it now is just becoming worse and worse. So in 2021, we asked ourselves, what is the situation of children? What are they living on a daily basis? And we couldn't answer that question due to the lack of evidence. And if there was any existing evidence, it was more not covering all the population groups in Lebanon, basically. So this is why we initiated, or we embarked on the Child Focused Rapid Assessment, to really advocate on the rights of children and the needs of children among stakeholders and among also the community itself, and to raise awareness on the deprivations that children are facing, to inform really programming and also to inform policymakers. So what type of data did we collect? In the Child Focused Rapid Assessment, we tried to cover all aspects of deprivations, or otherwise we could say that it's a right-based approach. So we collect data on different sectors, namely water and sanitation, hygiene, and also household living conditions, the health, nutrition, education, protection, and coping strategies. And we also take into consideration that the child is at the focus of all of this data, but with the caregivers as well. Of course, the survey also collects data on and disaggregates the findings by sex of the respondent, the age, nationality, and other also variables such as the education level of the caregiver. In terms of the timeline of the CFRA, as I said, it started all off with the question of what is the situation of children now in Lebanon. We did the first round in April 2021. Then we did the second round in October. Now we're showing the results of the third round, which is the first in 2022, and we're planning for the fourth at the end of this year, hopefully in December 2022. How do we do it? Basically, we train through Bridge, Outsource, and Transform, as a partner for UNICEF. We train a group of youth between the ages of 18 and 25 on how to collect data over the phone. So it's a 15-minute interview with caregivers or with households who have at least one child. And the numbers are randomly selected from 3 different databases for each of the 3 different nationalities in Lebanon: the Lebanese, Syrian refugees, and the Palestinian refugees. In terms of sample size, we took around 1,500 families, or they represent 1,500 contact numbers, 700 Lebanese, 400 for Syrians, and 400 Palestinians. So the results are, the key results are per right. So the first right that we start for is the adequate standards of living, or it's the household living conditions. We can see that although that 95% of people do have access to improved drinking water source, really half of those, 44%, they're using the water from bottled mineral water, and that's quite expensive here in Lebanon. And that we know that with time, this will become even more expensive, putting more families at risk of not being able to buy drinking water. In terms of crowdedness, 44% of people are living in a crowded house, which basically means that there are more than 3 people using the same bedroom. Everybody had some source of electricity, as reported, but the average number of electricity was 5 hours a day. And so when it comes to access to internet, 3 out of 10 households, around 30% of all those that responded, did not have any internet access at home. Hygiene. So 4 out of 10 households did not have access to female hygiene items or personal hygiene items. When I say female hygiene items, it means like we call them pads. Thank you. The pads and also the personal hygiene items would be a toothbrush and toothpaste. 60% of the caregivers reported not having any baby care items, and that would include diapers and other items. From the nutrition perspective, or the health of the child, 89% of the households, they couldn't provide their main diet diversity for their children. So they couldn't give them enough or types of food, different types of food per week. And 41% of their children only had 2 meals in the past 7 days. One out of 5, or 20% of all the caregivers, they suffered from diarrhea in the past 2 weeks. Out of those, only 30% did not get the treatment. In terms of mental health, when we ask caregivers to compare their child's mental health as from last year till now, 70% of them reported that the child's health is getting worse or is just worse. From a child protection perspective, 9% of all children, they worked at least 1 hour in the past 7 days in return for pay or money to help their family. And this number goes up to 22% among Syrian refugee households. 36% of caregivers, they reported feeling less tolerant when they're disciplining their children. So they had to be using more violent discipline rather than positive discipline. Last but not least, also something that emerged in that finding similar to the one in the qualitative, and that's the right to play. Almost half of all households who have children between the ages of 3 and 5 have no toy whatsoever to play with at home. And half of them are not even attending any form of education, such as nursery or kindergarten. And thank you. Now, I guess we're gonna go to the video. So we're gonna now see a video which basically goes over all the findings of the both studies, and it will show you more the perspective of it from a community level.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Before I move on, Jamil, Yasmin, do you want to share any closing words, or should we open the floor to our discussants?
We can jump into the discussion too.
Great. Okay, well, let's start off now. So as I noted in my introduction, we are very grateful to have two discussants with us, Mr. Adib Nami. Maybe we can start off with some reflections from your end, and then we'll move towards Ms. Amelia Charles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will speak in Arabic, so please.
Great, and just to mention for those who want a translation, as Mr. Nami speaks in Arabic, you can look to the globe at the bottom of your screen to get simultaneous translation. Please, the floor is yours.
شكرا. أولا شكرا ليونيسف LCPS على الدعوة وعلى تنظيم الشغل، وشكرا بشكل خاص للصديقين سارة ومكرم يلي كمان أنا يعني صار زمان ما التقيت فيهم لأن لوجودي خارج لبنان. أولا بحب أقول بأنه شكرا لليونيسف على هذا الشغل اللي عملته، وأنا يعني سعيد جدا بإني أشوف 3 أشكال من تقييم الوضع ودراسة الوضع بالعروض اللي شفناها هلا من شوي. شفنا فيديو بالآخر مع أنه مرق بسرعة، وقبل منه شفنا نوع من استطلاع رأي دوري كل 6 أشهر لبعض المؤشرات الأكثر أهمية، وهذا عمل كمي وعمل دوري. وشفنا بنفس الوقت شيء اللي اسمه البحث النوعي أو الكواليتاتيف سيرفي يلي انشغل، وهدول أساليب متكاملة. وأنا شخصيا من الناس المتحمسين جدا ومن المشجعين جدا على أنه نعطي أهمية أكثر للشغل النوعي وللشغل المركب يلي بيدمج ما بين الأساليب. وأنا يعني أرفض كل فكرة لأنه ينعمل نوع من تراتبية إيرارشي بأنه هذا أحسن من هذا وهذا أكثر دقة من هذا وهذا أكثر علمية من هذا. هذا شيء باعتقادي أنا غير صحيح، خصوصا عندما ندرس ظاهرات اجتماعية معقدة مثل الظاهرات اللي نحن عم نتعاطى معها. وبعتقد أنا مثلا بالنسبة لي الشيء اللي شفته بالاستنتاجات النوعية، الشيء اللي شفته كمان بالعرض حول ال6 أشهر قضي، بعتقد إنه هاي النتائج يعني منطقية جدا، وبعتقد إنه قريبة جدا من الواقع. وعم نحكي هالشيء بصفتي أحد الأشخاص يلي اشتغلوا فترة طويلة على موضوع دراسات الفقر والسياسات الاجتماعية بلبنان، وبقدر أقول يعني على الأقل أنا بشعر بأنه هذا شيء منطقي جدا. هلا بدي أعطي بعض يعني الأشياء للتفكير والبعض الملاحظات. أول مسألة بدي أوقف عند التحفظ يلي مرق بالعرض عن الدراسة النوعية الكواليتاتيف، بأنه هي منا ريبريزنتاتيف، ما فيها تكون معممة. وأنا بشوف بأنه هذا تنازل نحن الناس اللي بنحب نشتغل بالقضايا الكواليتاتيف مش ضروري يعني نكرسه ونثبته ونقبل فيه، وهو ليس صحيحا. ممكن دراسة كمية. في حدا عم يقول انه ما عم يسمع، باقيين عم يسمعوا ولا بس حليمة ما عم تسمع؟
الصوت واضح استاذ.
تمام الصوت واضح.
اوكي. فاول شغله بدي اقول نحن ما حدا يعني ليش بدنا يعني نقلل من اهميه البحث النوعي. انا مني وليش لنقبل بانه نتائجه غير قابله للتعميم. في بحث كمي بالعينه والى اخره ممكن تكون نتائجه غير قابله للتعميم وفي بياس، وفي بحث نوعي ممكن كمان اذا استوفى شروط معينه يكون قابل للتعميم. المشكله مش انه في واحد قابل للتعميم وريبريزنتاتيف وواحد منه تمثيلي منه ريبريزنتاتيف، مش هذا الموضوع. هو كيف نصمم البحث. اللي عادة نسبة عدم اعتباره له طابع تمثيلي للبحث بيكون غالبا ناتج عن انه حجم العينة بالبحث النوعي بيكون حجمها صغير. ما حدا قال لنا بانه ما فينا نعمل بحث بالعينة حجمها كبير. يعني اذا عم نحكي عن 125 او 165 مشارك ب 20 فوكس جروب او مجموعة نقاش PPVD، يعني اللي هلا بالاسلوب الجديد اللي معتمد، ما في شيء بيمنع بانه نضربهم ب10 ونعمل عينه اوسع، وبالتالي بتصير تمثيليه. والحقيقه انا ادعو اليونيسف وادعو الجهات اللي بتشتغل والامم المتحده اللي انا اشتغلت معهم فتره طويله، ما بصير ضلكم عم تكفوا تشتغلوا بطريقه مثل NGO عم يشتغل يعمل بحث ويعمل 20 او 15 فوكس جروب. فيكم تعملوا 150 فوكس جروب، ما حدا بيمنع، وتتصمم العينه بطريقه انه تكون تمثيليه بشكل حقيقي. وانا بدعيكم انكم تعملوا، لانه طالما عم نضل بهذا النوع من الشغل حيضل في مين يقول لنا بانه لا هداك النوع من الدراسه اكثر ولا لا ولا. وبالتالي هيدي نقطه اولى، لانه الشيء اللي عم نسمعه والشيء اللي عم نشوفه والشيء اللي بنقدر نستخلصه من هذا النوع من الدراسات اللي شفناه يستحق أن نضع فيه جهود أكبر، ومن خلال هالجهود الأكبر نعطيه قيمة علمية أكثر وقابلية للتعميم. وهيدي مسؤولية الجهات نفسها اللي عم تعمل هالشغل، يعني تحط مزيد من الجهد لتعمله، ونحن يعني نشتغل كلنا لإعطائه القيمة اللي يستحق. بهذا المعنى يعني ما بيعود كمان الموضوع انه هذا تكميلي لهذا، خصوصا بموضوع دراسات الفقر. اسمحوا لي هون أنا أعمل 3-4 ملاحظات أساسية. أولاً، نحن يعني في خطأ شائع، وأنا بعتقد الدراسة اللي عملتوها هلأ أنتم تقع بهذا الخطأ. نحن عم نزرع فكرة عند الناس بأنه في نوعين من الفقر. في الفقر اللي كانوا يعرفوه، وفي الفقر اللي هو مالتي دايمنشنال، انه الفقر متعدد الابعاد غير الفقر هذاك. وهلا اثناء الحديث يعني انا سمعت ياسمين اكثر من مره تقول بوفرتي، ترجع تستدرك لا مالتي دايمنشنال بوفرتي. ما في بوفرتي ومالتي دايمنشنال بوفرتي، في بوفرتي. الفقر طول عمره هو متعدد الابعاد. المشكله كانت انه كان في مقياس احادي البعد للفقر. هلا اللي تغير انه عم نعمل مقياس متعدد الابعاد، مش الفقر، الفقر هو نفسه. كان في نقص احصائي، مش نقص بفهم الفقر وتعريفه، كان في نقص بادوات الاحصائيه، وكان يلجا لفقر الدخل او فقر الاستهلاك الحياه، وحتى منه فقر الدخل مونيمتريك، يعني اللي يقاس بالنقد، يلي هو كان مقياس اسهل، لانه وهو مقياس بالمناسبه غير مباشر. It's indirect poverty measurement. اما الدايركت poverty measurement القياس المباشر هو من خلال قياس الاحتياجات او الحقوق الاساسيه يلي الان صار متاح. فلذلك مش هذا جديد ليكمل القياس القديم. القياس القديم كان المونيمتريك، يعني كان هو القياس البديل، لانه مش متاح القياس يلي هلا نحن عم بنجرب نستخدمه. وهذا موضوع اساسي لازم بشجع على هالموضوع، وكمان لازم نصلح شوي طريقه الاستخدام. هو ليس الفقر متعدد الابعاد، هو دليل متعدد الابعاد لقياس الفقر. باللغه الانجليزيه ما في مشكله. مالتي دايمنشنال بوفرتي كيف ما عملتوها بتطلع هي ذاتها. بالعربي او بالفرنسي بصير مختلف الموضوع. نحن الحقيقه هو لازم نسميه نحن الدليل متعدد الابعاد لقياس الفقر. indice multidimensionnel de pauvreté، مش indice de pauvreté multidimensionnel، لانه pauvreté. ولازم نغير المايند سيت تبعنا اللي هو هذا الشيء الاساسي بالموضوع. هلا انا بعتقد بانه الشيء اللي ممكن ينشغل واللي لازم ينشغل هو نروح بهالاتجاه. ثم في مسألة ثانية بظروف لبنان حاليا، طالما نحن عم نشتغل على لبنان، أن نقارب الأزمة اللبنانية والأوضاع المعيشية اللبنانية حاليا من منظور الفقر هي مقاربة جزئية وقاصرة. لما كل الدراسات اليوم والتقييمات بتقول عندنا 80 أو 85% من السكان بحاجة إلى مساعدة الآن، معناتها ما بقى فينا نحكي عن الفقر، صرنا بدنا نحكي عن المستوى المعيشي العام للمواطنين اللبنانيين عموما بكل فئاتهم. لأنه مقاربة الفقر هي بحد ذاتها مقاربة تجزئ وتحاول أن تخصص فئة من الناس بالسياسات وبالقياس وبالدراسة وهذا لا ينطبق على حالتنا بلبنان. نحن اليوم عندنا وضع عام 85% من الشعب اللبناني يحتاج إلى مساعدة، معناتها بحالة فقر أو غير فقر ما بيعود، يعني ما بقى هذا الموضوع اللي لازم نبحثوا فيه، إنه فقره بنقيسه مين نعطيه مساعدة ولا لا. هذه مقاربة خاطئة. لازم نروح نحو الرايت بيزد ابروتش، اليوم مقاربة مبنية على أساس الحق وحماية اجتماعية للجميع ولجميع الأطفال وإلى آخره، مش نروح للمقاربة الجزئية، لأنه ما بقى موضوع فقر في لبنان، ليس هذا الموضوع به. وطبعا هون بفتح هلالين كمان لأقول بتمنى انه لما منظمات الامم المتحده اليوم او الجهات البحثيه بدها تستخدم وتلجا لاحصاءات، حتى الاحصاءات التي تصدر عن الامم المتحده رجاء اعملوا لها شويه كريتيك، لانه الارقام اللي عم تعطوها يعني منا بدها شويه كريتيك على الاقل. اولا ما في بلبنان 1.5 مليون لاجئ سوري، ما يعني ما في ولا رقم رسمي من هالنوع. الرقم الرسمي تبع إدارة الإحصاء بيقول في من أصل 4.8 مليون 800 ألف غير لبناني، سوري وغير سوري. أنا بعرف في شوية أندر استيميشن بنقدر نقيسه علميا بنصير بالمليون. منين 1.5 مليون فيه؟ يعني في شيء منه منطقي بالدق. ليش عم نقبله؟ ليه قبلانينه نحن ببحث علمي؟ ولما بنرجع كمان بحث انه بين سنه كذا وسنه كذا طلع الفقر من 40% ل 80% كمان بدراسه صادره عن الامم المتحده. ولما بنطلع على الدراسه بنلاقيها معموله كلياتها على بروجكشن حسابيه بالموضوع. واذا بنطبق المبادئ نفسها للبروجكشن الحسابيه على التاريخ السابق اللي هلا يعني اللي انه 80% كان سنه 2020، طبقوا عليه نفس الشق اللي صار بنصير 150% الان. ما بعرف يعني ليش في امتناع عن انه نحن نعمل يعني نعمل شويه نقد حتى للاشياء يلي نحن بنستخدمها. بخرج لاقول انا الحقيقه العرض اللي سمعته الان خصوصا العرضين المكملين يعني الكواليتاتيف والكوانتيتاتيف واللي شفته بالفيديو بعتبر بانه بيعطوا صوره كثير موضوعيه. بحيي اليونيسف على هالشغل الممتاز، ولانه هذا الشغل ممتاز يعني بشدد عليهم وادعوهم يحطوا مور ريسورسز ليرتقوا شوي بهذا الشغل ليصير شغل هو الاساس في تقييم الوضع الاجتماعي للاسر اللبنانيه من خلال تقييم وضع اطفالهم، لان وضع الاطفال هو المقياس لتقييم وضع الاسر بشكل عام. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Mr. Nami, for raising many critical issues. And I know we're going to have a moment later on for our panelists to engage to some of the questions you've raised that need to be addressed. Now, Ms. Charles, I want to just give you the moment to also share your reflections and your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Fadi, and thank you so much for the opportunity to actually comment on this really important contribution to the discussion on what the economic crisis has really meant for children and really placing children at the center of this analysis, because we understand how much the economic crisis has affected all aspects of children's lives. From, as we've heard already, from education, engagement in labor, food security, healthcare, including even their general safety in light of the impact that a deteriorating security situation is also having as a result of the economic crisis. And if we're not really looking at this from this more comprehensive well-being model, we are really missing an opportunity to understand how the economic crisis is affecting the future livelihoods of the country, as well as, of course, the physical and psychological well-being of its citizens. So I wanted to add to this conversation some of the indications that we also have from Save the Children's analysis in terms of what some of this coping has looked like at the household level. So Save the Children runs biannually household economy analysis scenario modeling, let's say. And we also have a national child wellbeing assistance program that we are conducting quarterly impact reports on. And from this data, we're really seeing a lot of some similar reflections on the ways that families are, for example, increasingly indebted, and how households have resorted to multiple new forms of coping mechanisms. So when it comes to debts, I want to highlight that, we have this idea in Lebanon that remittances have basically been shoring up the economy for years. And I think increasingly we understand that that's not really the case, especially for the poorest and the most vulnerable households. And Save the Children's analysis has really helped us to unpack a little bit how taking on new debt is an increasingly utilized strategy to secure, for example, food and other basic needs in the short term. And we've found in recent analysis that the reliance on aid is actually increasingly prominent, whether that is formal aid or informal from a community or a family, or from neighbors. But this was not commonplace prior to the crisis. So aid is now a major new source of food and income for all income groups, including the middle income. So I think that's a really damning indication of the ways that families are trying to now shift in order to ensure that they can meet the basic needs of a family. And one thing, of course, that was mentioned in the presentation we saw earlier and in UNICEF's report is the resorting to worst forms of child labor, resorting to children working, but increasingly we do see the worst forms of child labor are becoming more and more common. The Interagency Child Protection Working Group has seen that about 50% of cases in case management currently are in worst forms of child labor. So this is really concerning, and this is obviously quite a big increase. And we're seeing this from Save the Children's analysis as well, that the amount of Lebanese children who are now engaging in work has increased tremendously since prior to the crisis. And that this is also increasingly impacting school attendance. Similarly to what UNICEF has found, Save the Children's assessments indicate that over 20% of children say that working is more important than education. And this is also, I think, really indicative of some of the things that have come out in UNICEF's presentation and analysis about the role that the child feels they now need to play in ensuring that household income. And we've also seen that that parents and caregivers also really understand and are open about how important having a child working in the family now is in this economic environment, and that they are forced to make those choices between whether my child can go to school or whether a child needs to be working in order to help support the family. From Save the Children's analysis, we've seen that the spending on education in families has about halved. So it's decreased substantially from a pre-crisis scenario. And that is despite that we know there are increases in education costs. There are increases in the cost of transportation, increase in the cost of data and communications in situations where we're doing remote and blended learning over the last couple of years. And so this is really a proxy indicator for us also to understand the way that households, because of the financial crisis, we can see how school attendance and through spending on school, how school attendance is increasingly impacted. And at the same time, we see in the poorest households that the proportion of their spending is increasingly on food. So this really demonstrates the decrease in purchasing power that families have, and that increasingly child labor is one of the coping mechanisms that they are using to address this situation of basically having to resort to whether my child can eat or whether we can go to school. So this really, the findings from this study, I think, underscore the ongoing analysis of how this increasing impoverishment and the economic crisis are pushing children out of education and into the workforce. And that children really feel this stress. They feel this stress on a emotional level, and they also feel the stress on an access to basic needs level. Children in our analysis also report directly to us that they have less food to eat, that there is less dietary diversity at mealtime. And we can see from a more household level, the way that families are spending more on cheap carbohydrates rather than on even things like small amounts of dairy and eggs. So, I mean, what this means is that families have less to eat. They're eating less nutritious food, and it's increasingly pulling children out of education and potentially pushing them, especially children from poor families, pushing them into adult responsibilities at a very young age, increasing their vulnerability, increasing their likely exposure to exploitation, to harassment. And when you combine this overall picture with a loss of education as well, it's likely to have real and long-lasting impact on both their lives and on the future of Lebanon as an economy. So there's two things that I want to kind of suggest as a response strategy, things that I think as a practitioner, it's important that we pull out from this analysis. And one of them is to encourage some more localized monitoring, even if at just a governorate level, because this type of looking at poverty from a multidimensional lens can help us to think through more clearly what a shock responsive social protection program could look like, especially if that is addressed at a level where you are at a more localized level, for example, at governorate, where it is where you're likely to see differences in that household resilience erosion. And it can also, if we look at a localized level, help us to understand what community preparedness mechanisms we might want to look at putting in place. Now, one example, again, from household economy analysis, we know that Baalbek is still consistently among the most vulnerable governorates, that the poorest families there are barely meeting a minimum daily caloric intake. So this is one dimension, one way of measuring poverty, but it's a very, very extreme measurement, actually. And with the introduction of more localized or governorate level multidimensional poverty monitoring, we have an opportunity to help us understand risks and preparedness and potentially social protection programming that can address these issues at a more localized level before it gets to the point of caloric deficit, which is very extreme. And it can also feed into the way that we respond at a community and localized level. For example, supporting more locally driven anticipatory action responses as well. The other thing that I want to mention in terms of how important a multidimensional approach is for a response is when we're looking at overall child well-being measurements. And one way that Save the Children is looking at this is with a cash plus approach, where we've combined cash for households with targeted nutrition counseling, with household financial management for the best interest of the child, specifically looking at many dimensions of child well-being, and as well providing savings support. And so far from this, we have found really significant impact. We're doing regular quarterly reports on the impact of this particular program. And we've found that in Q1, 90% of families are using fewer and less risky forms of negative coping. And in Q2, 99% of families are using fewer and less risky forms of negative coping. And the majority of households, in fact, 93% of households, say that this is a direct result of the counseling sessions that we're providing as a part of that cash plus approach. So I just want to highlight that as some impact we have seen from our programming to really demonstrate how important a multidimensional approach is for us to think about what is child well-being, and this type of study, how important it is for us as practitioners, as policymakers, to consider when planning programming and planning a response to an economic crisis that has impacted so many areas of children's well-being and their future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Charles, for the insightful reflections. And thank you again, Mr. Nami, for your thought-provoking intervention. With that, perhaps I think I'd like to give the floor. I know we've heard a lot of different takes, and so I want to give the floor to our peers at UNICEF. Mr. Jamil, maybe you can respond to some of the different comments we heard, and then we're perhaps going to go to a second video by UNICEF. The floor is yours, Jamil.
Sure, thank you. I'm probably just gonna first of all thank you both for the comments and for the feedback. استاذ اديب يعني اوريدي المعلومات يعني كل الانبوت اللي اعطيتنا اياه بنقدره كثير واصلا بنتاخذ اذا بدك بعين الاعتبار. Thank you also Amelia for your comments, and we're always also up to date on the HEA that Save the Children does. So we also cover this in our own references, let's say. Just to probably answer two main points about the study being or small scale, or if we can make it of a larger scale, and the difference بين الكمي والنوعي. ما هو نحن من الأساس لأنه بلشنا بالكواليتيف ستدي كانت على نطاق جغرافي كله، غطى كل لبنان 8 محافظات وغطى ثلاث كمان جنسيات الموجودة بلبنان. بس البيربس تبع الكواليتيف أكثر هو يبحث نزول إذا بدنا نقول، يعني نبحث أكثر إن دبث بالموضوع لنقدر نرجع نستعمل الكمي أو الكوانتيتيف لنعمم على المجتمع او على التارجت البوبوليشن اللي عم نحكي فيها. فدائما بالكمي بنروح سو بالساتوريشن مثل ما بنقولها او الشبع، يعني بس نسمع الخبريه مره 2 3 4 5، يعني اذا عملت 60 80 90 او 100 رح اسمع نفس الخبريه، فخلص في محل بوصل بقول هاي هي الخبريه، بعدين بقيس حجمها quantitatively. واكيد نحن كيونيسف our research agenda goes that way, mixed methods approach دائما لحتى اول شيء نعمل triangulation بنقول للداتا وناخذ الداتا من عده sources. هيدي اول شيء بتزيد credibility للداتا تبعنا وبتاكد لنا انه المعلومات اللي عم نجيبها هي صحيحه ودقيقه. وكرمال local level, as Amelia you mentioned, the local level differences and the equity in data and evidence, actually definitely this is something that we look at not only بس على المحافظات, we also look at the level of the sex of the household, the child, the sex of the head of the household, education level, wealth index, nationality, disability status, and so many other disaggregations that are important for us to make sure that there's equity and equality when it comes to the evidence that we generate. And that said, to do such a survey or to generate numbers on governorate level, to be able to cover and leave no one behind, let's say, and to be able to represent each population and each governorate adequately, you really need a lot of resources. And fortunately, UNICEF globally, we've developed and we technically support and financially support the multiple indicator cluster survey, or the mix, which we now, September 16, last Friday, we actually signed the MOU with CAS, with the Central Administration of Statistics, مركز الإحصائي. They will lead, they manage, and they will implement the mix in 2023. It's the largest source of data when it comes to children. It gives us more than 160 indicators. We're talking about regional and sub-regional level, covering 3 different nationalities as well, even reporting on SDG indicators, sustainable development goal indicators that come from the mix. So, and the last mix was done in Lebanon in 2009. So it's also not easy to do research in Lebanon. It's quite of a peculiar context, let's say, and it's sensitive. I mean, let alone we have census since 1932, before the country was even took its independence, like a decade before that. So it's not that easy when it comes to evidence generation in Lebanon, really. With regards to the numbers, and I know that we have different sources of numbers and different numbers as well. This is why we try to be very, very critical when we choose our source of data or the evidence that it's coming from. We always make sure that it's a credible source. We triangulate, we compare, as Save the Children noted, that like similarities between the findings across different organizations and also across within the organization itself. So it's something that we'll also look at And 1.5 million, just for the reference, it's part of the LCRP or the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. خطة الاستجابة للأزمة بلبنان تبع 2022 اللي طبعا it's done and written and developed by the government of Lebanon and the UN. When they reference, it's the 1.5 million Syrian refugees like this, for the reference in case it was mentioned again. And I think that's it, in a nutshell.
Great, thanks, Jamil. I believe you have a video you'd like to share.
أنا أخذت القرار إنه أنزل أشتغل مع عمي حتى ساعد بي وأمي بمصروف البيت. أنا كان كمان بي يعطيني مصروفي من قبل، يعني هلا إنه معاش أمي وبي مش عم بكفي.
كتير تغيرت حياتنا. هلا المصروف أكتر من المدخول. الصغار ما عم يتقبلوا الوضع، عم يكبروا الأولاد أكبر من عمرهم.
يعني الأيام اللي عم نوصلها ما في يوم بيجي أفضل من اللي راح. بالبيت 4 أولاد، يعني صار في فراغ وحرمان. هالإحساس هذا صار يحطم له اللي هو بده يتمناه لقدام المستقبل.
لما قررت إنه أنزل أشتغل مع عمي حسيت إنه أنا هلأ صرت عم بلعب دور أكبر بالحياة. صرت وفر عبي، مثلا أنا جاي عبالي أشتري شيء ما خلي بي أدفع، أنا أنزل أشتريه.
فلذلك الأب يعني بالأيام هذه عم بحس بإرهاق شديد وعجز كامل، بتحس إيداك مربطين مكبلين.
كأم حياتي كتير صعبة، عطول في عقدة ذنب، في أشياء يطلبوها ما قادر تأمن لهم إياها. عنا عيد الأضحى، جارنا جاب لنا قطعة لحمة، كانت بهاء عنده عيد، مش بس عيد أضحى وعيد الثاني إنه العيد اللحم.
وأعطينا الفخذ، أنا انبسطت كيفت.
مطرح ما هو بيشتغل مع عمه بتقول عنه رجال عم بيشد من قوته قد ما فيه. بعد شوي معش قلنا سلطة عليه خلص هو رجال. هي كلمة أنا حر من هلأ عم نسمعها من بهاء من عمر 13 سنة. شو خلينا لقدام؟
أما هون لما أجي أشتغل مع الأكبر مني اللي هن الرجال في مني بيعطيني قيمة.
هلأ بالصيفية بيروح مع عمه بيشتغل وبالشتا بيتعلم.
بكير عليه يتعلم أصعب على العمر، فأنا بقول له لا يا بي، قد ما فينا أعلمكم بدي أعلمكم لآخر وقت بعمري. يعني هلا شبعوا على المرحلة اللي له، يعني كيف بده يعيش؟ بعيش بمأساة. يعني بيجي على البيت لهون ما في شيء بده يتسلى فيه.
كنا ننزل نلعب بعد ما نيجي من المدرسة ونخلص الدروس، ننزل نقعد نلعب أو على التليفون. صار هون نحن عنا ما عم يجيب لنا كهرباء، كلمة ما فيش مازوت، مش عم نقدر نعمل شيء.
حتى هو مش حاسس بالأمان.
أنا رفيقي الوحيد هي اللي بسيني. أنا لما أرجع من الشغل كنت تعبان متضايق من حدا وبكون بس لبسيني موجودة قاعدة حدي، إنه كل شيء أنا بتضايق منه بروح بحكي لها إياه. كيف ما فيها تحكي مثل الإنسان، وأهلي كلهم حاملين همومي. يعني إذا أنا بدي روح وأحكي لهم وزيد همي عليهم شو بصير ساعتها؟ هي طالما عم تسمعني، طالما أنا عم عبر عن مشاعري، كل شيء غضب فيي بظهروا مني.
التجربة اللي هو هلأ عم بعيش فيها كتير صعبة، حتى وجعه يمكن ما قادر يفضفض. يعني أنا ما بحب ابني يتوجع مثل ما أنا توجعت. يعني ما يطلب مني شيء وما قادر أعمل له، كتير صعب.
إذا ما في وضع معيشي استقر، طب هالصبر شو بده يصير فيه؟ هذا اللي أنا أفكر فيه كأب.
عندي أمل، كنت قلتها زمان بس بطل عندي أمل بشيء.
Such a powerful video. Thank you. Thank you for sharing it. With that, we're going to move towards the final segment of today's webinar, which is a moderated discussion. But I just want to take a moment to appreciate the weight of the video that we just saw. And again, I see some folks have started to put some questions. If you have any question that you'd like us to try and address in time, I encourage you to type it in the chat box. Please do not unmute your microphones. Now, with that, I wanted to start off our discussion with our two panelists from just a few questions, because we only have 10 minutes left. Your report draws special attention to the particularities of child poverty in Lebanon. And we had this discussion, early on about what are the defining characteristics that make it multidimensional, and why it's sort of important to emphasize that point, and how it doesn't take away, rather it only emphasizes the state of poverty in the country. So I just wanted to give you a moment maybe to explain how your report complements other studies on the state of poverty in the country.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the question. So basically, the peculiarity about the multidimensional is that it's a right-based approach, right? So to begin with, the framework that kind of informs it and guides it is the rights of the children. And when we talk about poverty, which is the conventional method of or definition of poverty, we're talking about income or expenditure or asset. So it's something related to materialistic or monetary. But when we come to children, it's deprivations that they really lose. So it's the right to education, the right to health, the right to a clean and safe environment, the right to be protected. And all of those are within the hands of right holders and duty bearers. So the child is even like more vulnerable than just how much money might their father or mother make per month. So this is, if you want, the aspect of the multidimensional poverty when we look at it from a right-based lens. And also our study, both of those studies basically, first the qualitative one complements the existing literature that talks about the monetary study. I mean, they're not, the two are not, they're not like contradicting each other, but they are mutually exclusive. When we see poverty from one index and when we see poverty from a multidimensional perspective, and we take it further from just income and expenditure. So it complements it in that way, gives it that we understand more the in-depth of what does it mean to be a poor child or a poor person in Lebanon specifically. So that's also another perspective to it, that it contextualizes really the understanding and the definition of poverty in Lebanon. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. And when we discuss childhood poverty, we need to also address caregivers. How do your studies, both quantitatively and quantitatively, situate caregivers, households, and families in your assessment of childhood poverty?
So basically, all our research and our evidence generation are governed by the rights of the children, but also the socio-ecological model. So we always have the child at the center, and those two studies are structured that way. You can have a look, of course, at the full reports that are available online, and they talk about the world of the child, and this is where we basically speak about the child, him or herself, not going to education, not being protected, not having a safe environment. But then again, the caregivers as well, they play an important role within the socio-ecological model of the child. So here we talk about the world around the child, and the caregivers, the peers, the friends, as they grow older into adolescence. But also we take it further than that, because to be able to work on a specific child outcome, we cannot just work with the child directly, him or her. We need to work with the caregivers, with the friends, with the institutions as well, and with the systems, and at a larger scale, even when we talk about policy and when we talk about reforms and law reforms and strategies at a national level as well.
And what's the relationship between poverty and inequality in Lebanon? And I ask, can poverty be increasingly collective and yet still have disproportionate impacts on those with existing vulnerabilities?
mean, the evidence quite shows the two studies basically really should tap upon this in particular when it comes to poverty, equality, and equity, to add to that. So we can say that, yes, there are floating numbers as like 80% are poor. Let's consider that everybody's poor in Lebanon, right? In one way or another. But the level of poverty and the dimensions of poverty are not the same across everybody. Take the example of a girl in Lebanon who's Syrian refugee. She is 12 years old, living in a rural area where barely has access to any services and being married off by her caregivers. So despite that, the fact that she's poor, but there are layers that make people even more vulnerable. And this is where we talk about the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And those layers and multidimensional layers of poverty really where the equality and the equity comes into place. Another example could be children with disabilities. So when we talk about children not being in school or not learning in general, and then we say about children not learning and still also have another kind of challenge in their life, which is their disability, that's another layer of equality and equity when it comes to poverty in Lebanon.
And in just a few words before our last question, can you tell us why the focus on childhood poverty is so important and yet at times overlooked?
I mean, the child is the most important member of the community is really the child, right? Because otherwise, if we don't work on the poverty of if you don't support, let's say, that aspect, it will be kind of counterintuitive, let's say.
And on a final note, and I know there are many questions, but we have to end at 4:30. What are some of the main takeaways from the study and recommendations you'd like to highlight?
First and foremost, that we are in a situation that it's as dire as it can be, as we can imagine it. Really, children are suffering, and it's probably the time that when we see such evidence when it comes to the vulnerabilities and the deprivation children are facing in Lebanon, of all nationalities, of all age groups. And there are people who are more at risk, or children more at risk, such as girls being more at risk. Children with disabilities are more at risk. Losing childhood is something that is quite striking on a personal level. When I saw all of those findings, it was quite touching to seeing that children are losing their childhood and becoming adults at an early age. And this is something that we need to look at because it has a lot of implications, and maybe implications that we won't see now, but rather in the future. And also mental health. Mental health is really an important factor and really an important feature. Maybe in our country, it's still, it's still a new era that we're looking at, but we need to give it a lot of attention, especially when it comes to adolescents and older children, mental health and their well-being.
So with that, let me first thank you, Jamil and Yasmin, for the work that you're doing, for drawing attention to the plight of children, the plight of caregivers. Allow me to thank everyone, please, our two fabulous discussants, Ms. Amelia Charles, Mr. Adib Narmi. Thank you both for your insightful reflections. I want to thank your audience for your questions, those I was able to read. Thank you for drawing attention to important details. I'm sorry I couldn't get every single question. I will point our audience to a new article that we just published. Thank you, Ms. Sarah Haig from UNICEF. LCPS and UNICEF published a new article. It's on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and it touches on the themes that we talked about here today. I encourage you to look at our article. The report is also available online, as are the videos. Thank you all for such a thought-provoking and timely discussion. Thank you to the teams of LCPS and UNICEF, and I wish you all well.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you.
Thank you.